When we first encountered Stuart Mothrop's Reagan Library, we were befuddled. The first page, headlined by a mist-like image, read, "Were you dreaming? What do you think you're reading? Do not attempt to reconfigure your browser." The whole thing seemed inscrutable. There was no navigation, only underlined words signaling hyperlinks. But to where? As we clicked through Reagan Library, it became more and more inscrutable as we were transported through 4 color-coded worlds. We happened upon pages that were the same and yet different. Because this was a digital object, though, we knew that there was another way in. Code, in this case JavaScript, could provide a map, Mothrop's organizing logic, and the mechanisms through which that logic was enacted. The rub? None of us read code. Still, we opened up the JavaScript file. Though what showed up in pink was clearly text from the website, we were unable to decipher those multicolored strings of text and equation. We spent hours reading about JavaScript, but still understood very little. With few other options, we began to experiment. Finally, we returned to the pink text, which at least was recognizable. And just to see what would happen, we replaced the pink text, which we now know are JavaScript arrays, with mile markers. We replaced each pink phrase with a name and a number, pressed save, and revisited Reagan Library. What we saw was nothing short of a breakthrough. The phrases we had replaced with titles and numbers were embedded in the narrative. Not only had what we'd written shown up on the page, it was clear that Reagan Library was so difficult to understand because so much of its text was random. With renewed vigor, we explored the HTML files. We began to recognize terms, draw connections, and locate the patterns that, for us, unlocked the basic workings of Reagan Library. So here's basically how Reagan Library works. There are 4 narratives: blue, green, black, and red. Each tells the story of a different character. Each narrative is made up of 7 chapters, and each chapter is a scene from its story. Each chapter has 4 stages, which sequentially reveal more about its scene. The blue narrative tells the story of Emily St. Cloud. Emily, grieving for her dead father, tells us of her youth, her experience with psychotherapy, her visions, and her film career. The green narrative hosts a stand-up comedian talking to a psychiatrist, Dr. Chandra. The black narrative contains a prisoner who is sure that he's done something wrong and lit out for the islands. He cannot, though, remember how he got where he is or why he is being punished. And the red narrative speaks directly to the reader, evoking a sense that it is your world, that you, like the other characters, are working to figure out where you are and how you got there. The 7 chapters in each narrative, taken together, tell us its character's story. But each of these chapters contains 4 different stages. Each of the 4 stages is an iteration of the same chapter, but with less and less variant text and more static text. As a result, Chapter 1, Stage 1 is highly cryptic, while Chapter 1, Stage 4 is perfectly coherent. The hyperlinks on each page, however, are designed so that you can only access Chapter 1, Stage 4, the stage that contains the whole of that page's narrative, once you've already visited Stages 1, 2, and 3. The design is such that the more time you spend with Reagan Library, the more Stage 4 pages you have access to, and thus the more coherent it becomes. With this knowledge in hand, we now understood the code well enough to develop a rhetorically expressive remix.
It can be tempting to ignore new media and electronic literature as humanities scholars because they operate in ways we're not comfortable unpacking. We are drawn to the codex, the poem, the serial, and their predictable paratexts and architectures. It can be hard to decide how to refer to lines within a piece of electronic literature when they are never the same. We cannot leave encoding languages to be the sole province of programmers and web developers. At the code level, Reagan Library is just as static as any novel or poem. Performing remixes, as another scholarly intervention, can allow scholars to claim authority over web languages as if they were any other language. We decided to do a remix of Reagan Library to see if we could learn more about it through getting into its mechanisms and uncovering its expressive processes. Our experiment produced an artifact that revealed how the code expresses and disrupts conventional narrative and operates like poetic forms. I will discuss the process of approaching web coding language as a novice, learning how to read and interpret Reagan Library's JavaScript, and how we executed the remix. Ultimately, our project took the opportunity to create questions for further inquiry at the same time that we were able to gesture at a greater understanding of Reagan Library. We did not have much prior web coding experience before undertaking our remix. We knew enough to open the source code for the pages of Reagan Library and peek around, but we didn't know what we were looking at. We were only able to understand the mechanisms and the expressive processes underlying Reagan Library when we started manipulating, experimenting, and improvising within the confines of Stuart Mothrop's original code. We took a zip file from the electronic literature collection that's available online of Reagan Library and made a copy of the files. From here, we were able to look at how the hierarchy operated, how the pages related to each other, and how the narrative came together. We were able to learn everything about the structure through experimenting and testing things out, rather than relying on prior knowledge or by acquiring specialized training. As Maggie discussed earlier, we created a version of Reagan Library that replaced all of the variant pink text with the titles of the various functions and the numbers of the arrays that they referred to. When we played Reagan Library with these references in place instead of the original text, we were able to see for the first time how the JavaScript arrays operated to construct the narrative and how we might manipulate these processes to create something new. We were not able to experiment with the nominal functions because they were embedded in the VR QuickTime panoramas, which we were not able to alter. Because of this, when playing or reading our new version, we sometimes got stuck in loops, something that the arrays embedded in the panoramas prevented from happening. Without getting into the code and altering the narrative text, we may have never realized how much the narrative structure relies on each JavaScript array for Reagan Library to function at all. We hope in the future to be able to make a version that brings the nominal function back into play. For our second intervention, we chose to replace the variant narrative text in Reagan Library with the text of Samuel Coleridge's poem Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We chose to use Rime of the Ancient Mariner because we felt a kinship between the two texts, and simply because Rime of the Ancient Mariner had enough text to mine for this project. We stripped Mothrop's text out of the arrays first, and input lines from the poem that were structurally similar to the text that Mothrop used, so that, theoretically, sentences that were pieced together using the arrays would still make sense in our version. Once this process was complete, we moved on to the individual pages. Because we weren't able to alter the VR panoramas, and because we were not working within large blocks of prose, our remix is most interesting in the beginning, where there is more randomized text. Hypertext fictions shift and change, manifesting for individual readers in unique ways. Close readings are contingent on static text, and this methodology does not lend itself to handling electronic literature at the screen level. While some might argue that this proves that electronic literature is undeserving of scholarly consideration, we would argue the opposite, that remixing is a very productive method for interpreting electronic literature and other new media work.
The many references to games in Reagan Library suggest the game-like elements of hypertext fiction. Video games are attracting more attention from scholars in the humanities. In the emerging field of lidology, the study of games, some lidologists believe that scholars in the humanities are trying to colonize games by foisting their own methodologies onto games, such as narratology. This has resulted in disciplinary turf wars about games. Lidologists suggest that games and narratives are just too fundamentally different, and that narratology cannot adequately articulate the mechanics or the expressive scope of games. Ironically, while literary criticism on the narratology of games has received a cold reception by lidologists, literary scholars themselves have given a cold reception to electronic literature, which tends to have important gaming elements. New media scholar Noah Wardrop-Fruin notes that many literary critics have dismissed electronic literature as either narratively weak or too opaque to warrant serious critical inquiry. In Reagan Library, Mothrop uses the phrase crimes against the humanities, sardonically alluding to the disdain some literary scholars have for electronic literature. But like much electronic literature, Reagan Library occupies a territory between literature and games. The problem with literary scholars imposing narratology onto games and their simultaneous marginalization, or perhaps condescending tolerance of electronic literature, is that neither response meets their object on its own terms. Literary scholars are not engaging in what Catherine Hales calls media-specific analysis, in which, quote, the physical nature of a medium is not incidental, but central to the analysis, end quote. In the case of a hypertext novel like Reagan Library, a successful interpretation would account for the novel's materiality, including its images, its fluidity, and its combination of code with natural language. Of course, narratology can be useful for examining the narrative elements of electronic literature, but where it falls short is in its inability to accommodate the interactive and procedural elements of electronic literature. Conversely, lidology can accommodate these elements. However, it cannot speak to narrative. We argue that electronic literature, as a hybrid genre, requires new methods of analysis, and we believe that remixing is a very productive method for engaging electronic literature for the following 3 reasons. 1, it is media-specific. 2, it allows us to play the text like an instrument. And 3, it gives us a vocabulary to address social and ethical questions typically considered the domain of traditional critical methods. First, remixing is media-specific. It treats literature not as traditional literature presented in digital form, but as the unique mode of expression that it is, engaging its code and not just its surface output, giving us insight into the expressive and rhetorical processes that exist at the level of code. Secondly, remixing plays electronic literature like one would play an instrument. Malthrop likens the participatory dynamic of electronic fiction to playing a guitar because it invites engagement and interaction in ways that reward repeated experience, much like a game. This is one reason Wardrip Fruin calls hypertext novels textual instruments. Of course, remixing is nothing new, but it is typically associated with music rather than literature. Accessing the tracks on a master tape or the digital files of a song, what we might consider the code that allows the music to play, enables one to manipulate, reconfigure, and reinterpret that song. Through this type of interaction, remixing broadens and illuminates the expressive scope of a work, which is what electronic fiction invites the reader/player to do. Remixing Reagan Library highlighted some thematic and structural components of the fiction. For example, central to any human experience are the different ways in which we create, store, and lose memory. And this gets thematized in Reagan Library, because Reagan Library's code interweaves random sentences into the static yet repeating text, adding some new text while discarding old text. That memory is never experienced in the same way, even for the same character. Furthermore, investigating Reagan Library's code strongly suggests code similarity to poetic form. Like code, poetic forms, such as a sonnet or a haiku, put procedural constraints on what can be said and how it can be said. Rhyme, meter, and stanza are not incidental. They are expressive, and they provide analytical inroads into a poem's meaning. And this is what Reagan Library's code provided for us, and one of the reasons we chose to remix it with poetry instead of prose. Finally, there is an ethically and socially useful purpose in remixing. As an interpretive method, remixing offers many of the same results that critical methods offer literary scholars, only in a much different way. New media theorists such as Wendy Chun, Ian Bogost, and Wardrip Fruin have suggested that understanding the rhetoric and the expressiveness of procedures that lie beneath the surface output enables us to understand the social, political, and economic structures that govern every aspect of our lives, including commerce, media, advertising, education, and surveillance, all of which function according to the affordances and constraints of invisible code. Like traditional critical methods, which give us tools to examine the invisible ideologies that lie beneath the surface of a text, remixing at the level of code gives us a vocabulary to understand and question these ideologies that are embedded in code. And we believe that electronic fiction, since it invites engagement rather than discouraging it, will compel more teachers, students, and readers/players to interact in socially productive ways.